You're listening to the Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Eric Schmidt, and my co-hosts today are Paul Matteis, Sam Fazeli, and Brian Skorney. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. Brian, Sam, Paul, welcome and congrats for surviving a little bit of a wild and wacky week. I guess the news of the week has to be, once again, the Sarepta drama. I know we covered Sarepta in quite a bit of detail on last week's Biotech Hangout, but it seems like it's a whole new can of worms again this week. So maybe, Brian, you could take it away and inform our listeners of just what happened in this crazy situation of late.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny. I think I was listening to Biotech Hangout last week, and I thought, and as interesting as the Sarepta news had been up to that point, I think the real sparks started flying just as Hangout was finishing up. So, just to recap what happened last week, there were a couple of events in sequence that occurred. On Wednesday, Sarepta made a big announcement about a restructuring plan. There had been 2 deaths on Elevidys, their gene therapy for DMD, that have occurred this year in the commercial experience, both of them in non-ambulatory patients. This was leading to concern about what the sales of Elevidys were going to be. There was definitely clear hesitation among physicians, parents to continue to use Elevidys, although it was still, they were still seeing demand, they were still seeing hundreds of millions of dollars of sales per quarter. There was concern that these safety events were sort of accelerating. They had stopped shipping for non-ambulatory patients, were continuing to ship for ambulatory patients. I know, talking to investors, there was a lot of concern about would they be able to meet a lot of the debt payments that they over the next 2 years, some of the milestones to their partnerships. So they had this big call, went up, they should to cut back on some of the operations and provide sort of a floor opportunity on 11. Not said on that call, and a bit of debate started on this on Friday, because we sort of asked whether or not there were any safety events driving the decision to stop the programs in limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. A group of indications that they had been targeting and talking about similar indications, but potentially addressable the same Elevidys with some DMD using an AAV RH74 vector with a protein to sort of reconstitute the missing protein in these diseases. They, sort of didn't provide a direct answer, but I think the assumption that they didn't announce anything was that there wasn't anything untoward about it. And then Thursday night it broke that there was a death in one of the girdle muscular studies. This was only 4 patients, one definitely concerning. I was told damage control conference call Friday morning, to explain that they didn't think that this was a material event. There were a lot of, I know I was on the call and asked pretty starkly, where their threshold for materiality is, and there's certainly a disagreement on the street and with Sarepta as to what constitutes a material update. And that's sort of where we left off last week. And then that was finishing up. It started breaking that the FDA had now asked Sarepta to voluntarily stop shipping Elevidys even to ambulatory patients. So essentially stopping all shipments of Elevidys to any DMD patients while they sort of worked out what the outcome was going to be here. Friday night, Sarepta said that they were refusing to follow this request for voluntary halt to the all shipments of Elevidys. Of course, a lot of people who would advise in this industry that when the FDA asks you to voluntarily do something, it's not necessarily a request to voluntarily do something, but more or less a demand. By Monday, Sarepta had relented and agreed to halt shipments of Elevidys, and now we're in sort of this limbo phase of, what will it take to get back on the market? And, almost on a, every 6-hour basis, we're getting information. Staff had sort of broken that a person high up in the FDA had basically positioned it that, it may be an insurmountable hurdle for them to ever get on the market. Endpoints broke too long afterwards. sounds like someone within the FDA is relenting a little bit and saying, oh, if they can demonstrate a better safety profile through a different manufacturing process, a different dosage in 10 to 12 patients, that maybe there would be a path to market. And I think that's where we sit right now. And the debate is really what constitutes a hurdle for getting this drug back on the market. And is there a hurdle? The head of CDER right now, Prasad, prior to his appointment to CDER, has been very outspoken critic of Sarepta, of the Elevidys approval. Peter Marks is his predecessor's decision to approve it over the objections of seemingly a lot of CBER staff. We put in our last week, we like to say, Van Prasad in all these situations. And he's the person that, I think we have to gauge what will he do, because so far he's been fairly active in his role as CBER director, chief medical officer, chief scientific officer of the FDA. And we've seen a number of decisions come out of CBER that haven't necessarily reflect a totally tonal change. There's been emails that were issued. It's hard to say that been approvals under Peter certainly through CBER since he's been appointed. So I think there's a big question as to, okay, are we in a new regulatory state here where you're really pleading for a hurdle that Prasad in his mind for getting this drug back on approval, which may be insurmountable. I was also through sector for a long time. This is really going to be politically helpful. I mean, if the FDA is really setting up an insurmountable hurdle to get this drug back on the market, they're certainly going to receive a backlash from the DMD advocacy groups, who are very vocal and very powerful. And to some extent, the DMD advocacy groups had kind of a diminished enthusiasm for Sarepta. But there's something to be said about, a regulatory agency saying, hey, no, you cannot have this product anymore. And even if there's, a view amongst physicians and parents and advocacy group members that risk reward doesn't make sense, so sort of denying parents and physicians the options of choice here when
Brian, your connection's going in and out just a little bit. You might want to check that. I don't know if you're near to a Wi-Fi connection, but we're having a little trouble hearing you. But thank you for that. Lots to unpack here. And maybe I'll just open it up to the broader team on, what the FDA did right or wrong here. Sam, sounds like maybe you got some views on how this should have played out or could have played out differently. Love to hear where your head is.
Yeah, look, I mean, Eric, I think quite a few of us around this conversation, I don't know the detail, but are parents. So, but first of all, I'll have to say, as I've tweeted earlier this week, my heart goes to any parent who had this hope and now is facing potentially not having the hope. But let's get back to what the situation is. From a regulatory perspective, the job of the FDA is to approve drugs with proven efficacy and a risk-benefit profile that favors the approval. When we went through this approval, I remember so well, and I did tweet over the episode where Brad and then a couple of you guys were on too, where we discussed this when the FDA first expanded the approval to include a variety of children where the data was perhaps a little bit more sketchy, and what the drug was approved on the back of perhaps not the most strongest of efficacy signals. So we've all had our conversations about that, and that was something that we worried about. And it did give us all a memory or a recall of what happened with the Alzheimer's drugs, although there you're not dealing with very young children, which is even more emotive, I suppose. But at the end of the day, it from a harsh regulatory perspective, it is their job to decide whether a product should be marketed with the efficacy that we know about and the side effect profile. Now, it can be proven that the side effect issues are entirely in non-ambulatory patients, which seems to be the case. I mean, this is not an ordinary side effect, right? This is a grade 5. These are deaths which are awful. So maybe there is a way that they could keep the product on the market, but I think this is going to be, as Brian very clearly said, a political hot potato. What's the right thing to do here is very, very tough. And you do always come back to, if there's absolutely no choice, should the parents not be given the choice of making that decision for their offspring, if it doesn't affect anybody else at all? It's very hard. I really can't put myself in their shoes and make this decision for the parents or the regulator, to be honest.
Paul, what are your learnings from this mess of a situation?
I mean, I actually feel like and I think in other topics today, I may be, and others may be more critical of the FDA. I mean, I give them some credit here. I mean, they acted relatively quickly, right? I mean, there's been reporting around Sarepta and just referring to the stat reporting, and, have they been sharing all the side effect data with the FDA? I mean, I think the FDA, look, we can look back at what Prasad had said about this approval from the beginning and kind of debate whether there've been biases here, but they acted quickly when there was a severe safety issue and they might not be getting all the safety information, right? I mean, this all happened really, really quickly. I think the only thing you could maybe even fault them with would be when you think about the impact on the community, like a lot of the details here have come through, really good reporting, but maybe a lot of this stuff shouldn't be kind of coming out that way and trickling out that way from just a pure public health perspective. But I mean, I guess the way I've always sort of seen it is like, and again, this is my bias. I've always felt like from the perspective of covering many other rare disease companies, I've always felt like Sarepta has benefited from a confusingly lower regulatory standard dating back to the exon skippers, right? And then not, ultimately not doing confirmatory work there. And so, I mean, I think hindsight's 2020, but I think ultimately, like, I don't feel like this whole saga is informing my view on how I'm looking at other biotech companies in this space. Like, I do think that there is this nuance going on in gene therapy where we're seeing a lot of companies get breakthrough or, these accelerated paths forward, but then some of the recent regulatory headlines, as Skorney was alluding to, have maybe been more negative and less flexible on the margin. But I view this, I've always viewed kind of the Sarepta plight as like a little bit of an outlier in the context of the rare disease space. And so thinking about it from the investment view, I just kind of don't really know even how I would extrapolate this into anything else. And, it's a really tough decision, and I totally understand the patient side, but I can definitely understand the FDA's perspective here. And again, I commend them for moving quickly.
Let me just pick up on one thing you mentioned, which is the communication channels here that the FDA has used to kind of disseminate its views. I think you're right that this communication through the media, through the great reporting at both Stat News and Endpoints and other channels. I mean, it is certainly unorthodox and probably not ideal. And initially, I guess I was quite critical of this, quote, senior FDA official who seems to be spilling the beans to the media before, say, to patients or their families, or most important, even before investors. We like to think we're important, but we're less important than the patients and their families. And I hope, honestly, that communication channel is cleaned up and it doesn't continue. On the other hand, the more I think about it, I kind of understand the FDA has been in a difficult place, right? It did go to the company and ask for the drug shipments to be paused and was refused. And clearly the communication between Sarepta and the FDA has broken down. That might be another whole topic of discussion, why it's broken down and who's to fault. And as Brian mentioned, it's pretty unusual for a company to refuse to do something that the FDA requests. And having been put in that situation, it may be that the FDA had no other choice. If it wanted the drug off the market, essentially it had to use the court of public opinion to force that. And maybe the most expeditious way of getting what it wanted was to go to the media. So, this is starting to kind of all make sense now from a communications pattern standpoint. But I have to say, I don't think it's ideal. It is a very, very messy situation for all involved. Paul, I think you're right. I hope it's contained, right? I mean, the worry here is that this further puts generalist investors off of our sector. It's pretty rare that we see a company that was going to have a $4 or $5 billion top line now weeks later become potential bankruptcy risk. So that is stark and unfortunate for everyone involved, including the investors, and really puts a pin on just how much risk is involved with our sector, even for those companies who seemingly, have it made. But Brian, you're closest to this situation. I think you got the last word on Sarepta and Elevidys. How do you think this should or will play out? Do you think the drug will ever make it back?
I think the whole situation is really, frankly, tragic, and I don't actually, I understood why Exondys was approved. I understood why Elevidys was approved. If I was a regulator, I probably wouldn't have approved them myself. I think one of the issues with approving drugs on low levels of is you get into this situation where removing things from market is a horrible, horrible decision to have to do. And I think, you read these anecdotes from parents who have kids who have been treated with the drug and they think it's enormously effective. Parents who have been trying to schedule their kid to get this drug, and now, don't have that option. It's really a horrific thing to go through. Whether it gets on the market again or not, I almost think it's going to be a political decision, right? I mean, I think you have Vinay, who is a very stringent regulator. I mean, and I think this goes way beyond just Sarepta. I mean, I think the world of Vinay. I think he's one of the smartest people I've ever met. I've learned a lot from his analysis, but he is a much more stringent regulator than a lot of us would be. And when you read what he says and the way he views clinical trials, like it's certainly a higher hurdle if he is the primary decision maker at the FDA. But I also think, he is pushing on something that I think he may regret opening up, and there's going to be a battle here, and it's going to be one of public opinion. It's going to be messy. I mean, I just think back to when Avastin failed in breast cancer and the drug was pulled. I mean, it was, despite the evidence, it was a very, very tough battle. And even McCain, which was really didn't have advocacy group support the way that DMD treatments do. But again, it was a big fight. So what the fate is, I think, has yet to be written.
Okay, well, certainly not the last time we'll be talking about Sarepta on Biotech Hangout. And Brian, you already alluded to another topic of discussion, which is Dr. Prasad's rigor in terms of new drug approvals. We'll speak about the situation and circumstance with Replimune's RP1 for melanoma in a bit. But before we get there, the other FDA topic of discussion this week has to be the new CDER director, Dr. George Tidmarsh. Sam, do you want to introduce this concept?
Yeah, so I think what's really good here is that George Tidmarsh has just been approved, put in charge of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Is different to the other three folks, if I could say that, in terms of Jay Bhattacharya, who's not obviously with the FDA, but Makari and Vinay Prasad, in that he actually has industry background. I mean, I'm sure that the others had interactions with industry, perhaps advised some industry. I don't know exactly, but certainly here we have somebody who is who's a veteran, if you wanted to use that phrase, not meaning old, but meaning somebody who's got experience. 4 companies from what I counted: La Jolla, Horizon, Coulter, Threshold Pharmaceuticals, in different times, and various types of products that brought to market. So and so he's replacing Jacqueline Carrigan-Curry, who was in position, who actually resigned or announced a retirement last month, and it's obviously one of the top positions to be in. And this is after, and Carrigan-Curry was in charge as acting CDER director since January, after Patricia Cavazzoni stepped down. So I see that as a positive, as somebody who's actually been in the industry, understands what it takes for certainly smaller companies to get drugs to a point where it gets to the regulator. I would say also that he's in many respects of the same mind as Prasad and Macari. I always get that wrong. In terms of the way that they think about things and the ideologies they've had, the policies that they thought were wrong previously, for instance, with the COVID-19 pandemic, etc. So those are things that I think are relevant, and I think it could be interesting to see what happens when we come to discuss direct-to-consumer advertising, drug advertising, prescription drug advertising, etc. So, what would be good to see is that is the control, getting some kind of alignment between CDER and CBER, because one of the problems with the FDA, and I think folks are going to talk about this now, is that it wasn't immediately obvious that the two branches or two divisions actually thought the same. When it came to drug approvals, some had lower standards or lower bar, let's put it that way, sorry, not lower standards, lower bar, and others were really holding drug companies to account for everything that they could possibly do. So that's the way I see it. I'd love to hear others.
Yeah, I think you summed it up well, Sam. On the one hand, Dr. Tidmarsh is coming from a very industry-centered background. He's run biotech companies, he's founded biotech companies, he knows the industry and he knows investors. So that's got to be a positive. He'll be, the first of these four HHS leaders, Bhattacharya, Makari, Prasad, to have really spent time in our industry, which has to be a positive. As you also laid out, on the other hand, he's kind of coming to it from the same perspective that those outsiders have in terms of being very critical of the agency. I mean, I think he actually met Dr. Makari at Dr. Bhattacharya's anti-COVID conference, at which point, these academics were criticizing the administration, the prior administration establishment's criticisms or criticizing the prior establishment for having stifled scientific discourse, right? So that's kind of how they all got their jobs. They were all outsiders looking in, all critical of the censorship of free speech. And it's going to be really interesting to me now that they're insiders, now that they are the establishment, how they're able to operate. It's maybe a little bit easier sometimes to criticize than to do. We just talked about a situation where around the Sarepta Elevidys drama, there hasn't been a lot of transparency from either side. It isn't necessarily easy to become the establishment and then still embrace those ideals such as transparency, debate, openness, et cetera, when you're running a large organization like the FDA. So I'm really curious to see how, not just Dr. Tidmarsh, but also Makari and Prasad continue to adjust their ways, as they've already have done for sure, but will need to do in the future if they want to maintain control and operation over such a large established group of scientists and review staff. But Paul, Brian, what do you guys want to add on this?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'd just like to talk about, I talk about with clients, is just sort of like the odd bedfellows that seem to have been made through disagreements on COVID, right? And what's really striking here is, like you said, we sort of see this uniformity from Trump to RFK Jr., Makari, Prasad, Tidmarsh, Bhattacharya, in all being very critical of sort of the COVID mandates and the way that the prior administration handled the pandemic, and not to understate the societal impact that COVID had on, the entire world is really tremendous. But when you kind of get beyond COVID, there's not that much uniformity in sort of world healthcare view among a lot of these guys, right? And I kind of mentioned this in the discussions about Benai, but right, you already see, and one of the things I thought was interesting on Monday, you saw Laura Loomer going all out to kind of criticize Prasad's appointment, and again, he does seem like a very odd choice to have, being this much of an activist role as a CBER, CMO, CSO appointee to FDA, when you hear sort of tonally GOP and Trump being very pro flexibility, and even, McCary saying things like, oh, if we just have, biological plausibility, we could approve things on that, right? I mean, that is the essence of how like an Elevidys would get approved, right? Biological plausibility. You show it in rats, and you could approve it. McCary sort of made those statements about ultra orphan drugs, but it's very dichotomous with a lot of sort of the framework of clinical design and the approach to regulatory that I think very clear about over his 20-year career. And if you read Ending Medical Reversal and all of the writings, it does seem at odds, and I just wonder how long these fellows can play nicely.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, like, we're still really figuring out like who this FDA like actually is, and I think that there's been a lot of paradoxes so far from my perspective, right? Like, on the one hand, what you just alluded to, Skorney, McCary's commentary on biological plausibility, I mean, that sounded like Peter Marks 3.0, right? From the perspective of flexibility and industry friendliness and, gene therapy, right? And we've seen a lot of companies in this rare space continue to get these regulatory agreements that, look very, very favorable, like small pivotal open label trials and things like that. On the other hand, you have this whole piece with Prasad, right, with just all the past commentary he's had, and then some of the recent things like what happened with that, what was that DMD cell therapy for the cardiac component, and then also the CRL last week. I think the other thing too, Eric, that you were saying about just this concept of transparency and discourse. I mean, maybe I can hit it quickly now because we don't have to spend a ton of time on it. But like, there was this panel this week around antidepressant use in pregnancy, right? And like, yeah, I think it's a really, I cover a lot of stuff in psychiatry, and my background before being on Wall Street was in neuroscience. So like, I think a lot of these questions are really, really interesting. And I think it's it's like a laudable goal to question, certain medical decisions that are made by default without great clinical data, right? There haven't been like incredible randomized controlled trials of antidepressants in women who are pregnant because those studies have like ethical issues, right? So I think like, holding an open discussion to kind of talk about risk benefit sounds very, very interesting in a vacuum. But then when you look at that discussion and how it played out, I mean, you have a lot of people, or at least a number of people on that panel, who have a reputation for being against antidepressants in general. And, again, I'll point people again to the stat article this morning. I mean, some of the quotes from that are just wild, right? When I think about just the depiction of mental health. And so I guess when I sort of take a step back, it's like, was that an open discussion, or was that a discussion geared around seemingly a preset conclusion to just question the orthodoxy? And so, I guess that's my long-winded way of saying, I was talking about this with one of my colleagues internally today. Like, I still feel like we're really figuring out who this FDA actually is. And when we think about stocks and we think about drug approvals, like, I think my FDA meter on just kind of the degree of flexibility and the degree to which this will look like the old administration versus the new one, I feel like it's changing every week. I mean, I guess now I'm leaning maybe a little bit more cautious, right? But still feeling like there's going to be flexibility. But it's hard. Like, I think we've got a lot of countervailing points of evidence right now on kind of who these guys are and who their governing philosophy is going to be going forward. Do you guys agree?
I do, and I'm going to come back to something Brian mentioned when he was talking about the Sarepta circumstances, how some of these decisions increasingly are coming down to a single person, a single leader, either Dr. Prasad or Dr. McCary, we presume, or maybe someone who reports directly to them. We don't know, but they're not seemingly being made with the rank and file constituents, the review staff at the FDA. And there was another report out this morning on how those rank and file review staff are increasingly heading for the exits. So maybe the decisions are being made out of necessity by individuals at higher up functions, or maybe the fact that the senior leadership team is willing to overturn so many different decisions by the rank and file is causing that exodus of talent. I don't know, but it's another trend, and one that I'm very mindful of, and I think one that we're about to talk about as we segue into what happened with Replimune. So maybe we should go right there and come back to others' thoughts on the functionality of the FDA. For those of you who are not aware, Replimune got a complete response letter, a CRL, earlier in the week. It has a drug called RP1 for refractory melanoma. Unfortunately, there are no good therapies for second line plus melanoma patients, response rates for the standard of care somewhere in the single-digit range. And the data that Replimune was able to provide in support of their BLA was fairly good. It had a response rate, the drug has a response rate in the low 30s, and a durability of response that's actually quite prolonged. It's an immunotherapy, so it does benefit from long-term tumor control. What the drug did not have was a randomized controlled study. That was well known now for many, many months, that they were going to try and get approval from a single arm study. And as we all know, that's not something that Dr. Prasad has been in favor of, either in his written work previous to coming to the FDA, or even some of his quotes through his FDA leadership. But through his listening tour, we did get a sense of that flexibility that you were mentioning, Paul, that he might be more willing to accommodate industry in cases where there was much unmet need and plausibility of mechanism, and also certainly some evidence of activity, all of which RP1 had. The company really, I think, was expecting to get approval. Certainly, they were acting in ways that would have you believe they thought they were going to get approval. Their mid-cycle and late-cycle review meetings went well. They had breakthrough designation for this drug, and they were all teed up to announce what we thought would be good news this week. But unfortunately, that CRL threw them for a spin. And it does seem like in this case, it was some higher up at the agency. We presume Dr. Prasad, who made the call here not to approve the drug, saying that a single arm study was not adequate to support approval in oncology, despite the unmet need here. So I've got many thoughts on this, but I'll pass it on to others. Maybe Sam, you want to speak? I know you follow oncology very carefully as well, and tell us how you think this should have played out.
Yeah, so look, when you look at the data, first they had the accelerated approval designation. So that is usually helps you get through the process, even though you've got a single arm study. When you look at the data, overall response rate, as you rightly say, in the 30% range. It did deteriorate a little bit from one readout to the next, but still above the 30-odd%. Pretty decent complete response rates. Half of that ORR was from complete responses, which is great. It's an off-the-shelf product. A bunch of patients had stable disease, and you rightly say this is a group of patients that don't have a lot. But what happened in the intervening period is that Amtagvi was approved. Now, that's not an off-the-shelf product. It doesn't have the same rate of CRs, although this is not in a head-to-head comparison. There are lots of reasons why you would be very careful in making these kind of comparisons, but that's what we have to do. But yet it was approved. So to a degree, you could say, I mean, in FDA's defense, that the standard of care changed a little bit. But in reality, again, oncologists are not, it's the same story as Blenrep, and I'm sure we can talk about that again, because last week we thought he might get a CR and then he didn't. That's a multiple myeloma drug. Oncologists are good at dealing with these situations. You give them a product, they find the right patients to treat with it, which is why it's so hard sometimes to model an oncology product in these kind of relatively niche settings. So, if it was me, I think I would have the opposite of what Brian said about Sarepta's Elevidys. I would have probably approved it and let the physicians decide how to use it. Again, Dr. Prasad knows how discerning oncologists are. Maybe the worry was that it would be in the community, they would be a bit more less discerning, but I'm not sure these patients end up in the community at the stage that they arrive at. So that's what my thought process is. But so it's unfortunate, and I don't think it's got a read through to anything else. On the bottom line, it's possible that the FDA can say, look, standard of care has changed. You should have had a control arm. We know that Opdivo is active generally, or checkpoint inhibitors are very active in melanoma. Should have had a control arm. But they could have told them that a year ago. Over. Just in case. So.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I think you're right, Sam. I think it is that kind of last minute change in tone, that arbitrary nature, maybe that singular individual driving the change that is potentially so disruptive to a company like Replimune. And the unfortunate thing here is that they don't have the resources to do a randomized controlled trial. If they are unable to successfully lobby for accelerated approval, which I assume they will not be able to succeed in doing, this drug's never coming to market. It's going to die. And I think if you had taken this product to KOLs, they would have supported the efficacy here. Obviously, it is an imperfect study, but most of the opinion leaders that we've spoken to believe the drug does work and should be offered to their patients who don't have other choices. So it's a little surprising to me the way this played out from a decision-making standpoint. We never went to panel. We didn't get the opportunity for KOLs to weigh in and provide their expertise, which I would have liked to have heard. But Brian, Paul, any thoughts again on the nature of this decision making?
To me, it's just like we're still figuring out what the deal is, for lack of a better way to say it. Like, I keep having companies tell me over and over, nothing has changed, or you see this or that agreement that appears bullish at face. And I'm not saying I don't believe what certain companies are saying that they got in writing from the FDA, but like I'm very, very interested in how the rest of this year unfolds when we see a number of these other products that are kind of coming to the FDA with some element of flexibility required for approval. I mean, I think we need to see, for lack of a better word, some wins in this kind of arena to, again, help us stay comfortable that for small biotech, the FDA is as open for business as a lot of investors hope they are.
Go ahead, Brian. Brian, we can't hear you. Okay, hopefully we'll get Brian back somehow. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, all right. Oh, there you are, Brian. Go ahead.
I think we need to all chip in and buy Brian a new phone.
Well, we'll see if he's able to come back in. But Paul, I agree. It's very well said. It seems like almost that anything that was agreed to in the past needs to be re-agreed to today under the new administration and leadership of the FDA, and there's going to be risk of surprises going forward, risk of uncertainty for sure. And we all know that investors hate that. So when it comes down to increased uncertainty in our industry, that means increased cost of capital, and that means something that's not directionally where we want to be for stock price movements. So we can hope for the best, but we need to see better clarity and transparency.
Eric, one of the topics we talked about earlier was the what does this mean for investors? It creates uncertainty, etc. But when I look at one particular story that's running with a single arm trial, and that's Arcellx, actually that stock price has been fine. There didn't suddenly seem to be a massive decision by investors that anybody with a single arm study is not going to make it. And you have to admit, in that particular case, there is a standard of care, or that has changed, is Carvykti. So there are other agents here, but you have a drug that potentially has a better side effect profile, potentially, right? I know this is contested. I know there's a lot of moving parts there. But so perhaps investors don't just jump to a final conclusion after such events every time, which is hopefully healthy to see.
Well, I know you want to talk about Blenrep as well, speaking of myeloma, Sam. So maybe that's a good time to just mention what happened there.
Yeah, no, very quickly. So basically, they had a pretty, what I would call a bruising outcome last week. Was it last week? I can't remember now. There's so much that happens in a short period of time. And the outcome, ODAC basically voted against the approval. And it was a pretty clear vote, right? It wasn't like a 4-5 or 3-4. In one of the trials, it was 7-1. So the vote was very clear. And what is interesting is that it would have been an obvious thing for the FDA to do is to give them a CRL, which they didn't. They've extended the PDUFA. We have looked at a whole bunch of other data sets that the company has that does show an opportunity to come back perhaps with a modified dosing request to the regulator, maybe 1.9 milligrams, etc. But just to summarize, the issues they had was they said the side effect profile at the dose that you're talking about, especially the eye side effect profiles, we don't like that. And there was also this talk about why did you only have 5% of your patients in the US? Now, I don't think the company can deal with that in 3 months, but they could certainly go back and talk about lower doses, longer times between dosing from other trials that they've had, such as Dream 14, etc., with the regulator. Again, the multiple myeloma community has endless numbers of drugs that they deal with. They have so many options, and they have so many permutations they have to choose from. They know, and they deal with seriously toxic agents in some of the older drugs that they were dealing with. Now we're a little bit better off. They know how to manage this. I think they should allow it. And what's interesting, of course, is that a whole host of other countries have approved it since, the latest one being the European Union. So let's see if that happens. Maybe Prasad here with his hematology hat on has been the opposite influence that we think he might have been on some of the other discussions. So fingers crossed, this is a drug that I think needs to be out there for the types of patients who can't access or can't take some of the other agents.
Well said. Paul, we also had another FDA decision in your neck of the woods, GH Research, and their clinical hold. Is this more garden variety, or is there some read-through to the FDA environment from this news?
This was really weird. There might be some other read-through. I think, like, as an analyst in the situation, there's such a level of like informational asymmetry, right? Like, it's not like I haven't looked at meeting minutes or correspondence, and so it's hard to opine with any level of like 100% conviction. But essentially, these guys have so far been unable to get their product off clinical hold. And the context here is it's an inhaled formulation of DMT, a psychedelic for treatment-resistant depression. They have phase 2 data from a decently sized randomized controlled trial in Europe with an unprecedentedly large effect size. Certainly there's a debate on how big will the effect size be in phase 3. Will that totally hold up? But regardless, the data look very, very good. The safety profile was considerably better than expected. And there's been a decent amount of phase 1 work too. So there's actually like a pretty good human safety database here. This was put on hold in the US, and they ended up doing development in Europe and the UK. And the FDA, I think it's almost a couple of years ago now, essentially had issues with a rat finding that was a laryngeal tox finding. And they wanted the company to essentially show and justify that this is a rat-specific issue. And so the company, at the FDA's request, reran a rat model and also ran a dog model being the mammalian model, and essentially showed that this didn't appear in dogs. There's also this meta-analysis of inhaled drugs that shows that this finding is not uncommon in rats. But for most drugs, the majority of the time, it's a rat-specific issue. So there's good justification here. It looks like they did what the FDA asked, and they have human clinical data. So, the FDA essentially asked them to provide further justification on why they believe it's a rat-specific issue, or something else, right? And what that something else would be is TBD. I think our view is that it's just based on the fact pattern and everything we know, it's almost hard to believe that, maybe one more correspondence will get this off hold. Like maybe it was something where they were responding to a number of FDA questions and it wasn't just going to be waving a magic wand, but it's a little bit confusing, right? I mean, you can speculate in a whole number of ways, right? Related to, is there a bandwidth thing? Are teams within the FDA talking to each other, right? Is the non-clinical team communicating with the clinical folks who've looked at the clinical data? Because the clinical data don't show any respiratory issue, and the company even did spirometry in their phase 2 study, which is, kind of like going above and beyond. So it's a little bit confusing, I mean, I think, again, extrapolation here is TBD. But, this agency, if we think about some of the actual underlying themes within this IND, right? I mean, this agency is, I think, geared up to potentially be, bullish for the psychedelic space, right? And more accommodating there. And they're also talking about, right, not wanting companies to to do clinical work ex-US just because they think they have to, right? And already predominant amount of the clinical work here has been done in Europe. So it's surprising for all of those reasons. I mean, I still feel like the fact pattern suggests this should get resolved in the near term, but I also feel a little silly. Like, what else can they really say to the FDA? And I think that's the thing investors are grappling with. Like, do we even really know what else the FDA needs to hear, given the case that's been presented so far?
All right, more mixed signals from the agency. I'm getting kind of wrapped around the axle myself, just thinking about all this stuff. Let's leave the FDA if we can, and move on to some of the clinical news from the week. And one of the better readouts, Paul, I guess, was the Alkermes orexin data. So would you like to tell us what we learned there?
Yeah, sure. Better readout, I agree, although the stock sold off. And I think that's more about kind of the market and tactical trading versus the drug itself. Orexins are a class of drugs for wakefulness promoting in the narcolepsy space and potentially other indications as well. This Alkermes trial was in narcolepsy type 1, and the data were positive, and the full data are going to be presented in September at World Sleep. The stock sold off. And I do think that ultimately kind of gets at sort of what the setup is here for this class and what investors take for granted and what they don't take for granted. It was widely expected that this drug would work in narcolepsy type 1. That's because the phase 1 data there was great. Takeda had multiple positive trials there, and the biological rationale is very strong. So in that press release, we know the drug hit on almost all the clinical endpoints except for one in a study that really wasn't even that well powered. So strong data. But the controversy here relates to safety. Alkermes in their phase 1 study has seen a few cases of quote unquote mild visual disturbances, which largely have been described as like light sensitivity. A few other companies have reported these as well. And I think as we get more data for this class, everyone's kind of trying to figure out what this is. Is this benign, modest kind of overstimulation issue, right? That is self-resolving, or is it a harbinger of something that is more severe? Our view from digging through certain FDA regulatory stuff for CNS drugs, like the requirements for doing driving studies, looking at other drug labels and labels around kind of monitoring and driving stuff, because I think that's really the main question here, is suggestive that if this remains a mild issue for these drugs, it should be of no real clinical or regulatory consequence. You can see a number of stimulants have this kind of issue: migraine drugs, antiepileptics, even some antidepressants. And so we've been bullish on the stock, and we've also been kind of just bullish on the category, that in the grand scheme of the standard of care in this space, which is oxybates, right? The safety profile of orexins looks very, very differentiated. But Alkermes in this press release didn't really give us any color on this piece and sort of said, wait for the full data, for the full safety update. And I think, opacity is often discounted even more than a mildly negative reality when it comes to stocks. And so hence the sell-off, and hence now we'll wait for World Sleep and see what they show us.
Great summary. I don't think we have to wait too long. If I'm right, the data will come out in September. So a little patience may be virtue here. Yeah. I mean, the other big news we had from a clinical standpoint was Abivax. ABVX is the ticker. I don't cover the name, but a big win in the I&I field. They have an oral drug. It's a MER24 enhancer, and read out positively in ulcerative colitis, UC. A lot of us had discounted the likelihood of success based on the mechanism here. It's a very strange, maybe even unclear mechanism as to how exactly a MER124 enhancer might go about having an anti-inflammatory effect in the colon. But that's exactly what happened here. The phase 3 data were really solid. We had about 15 to 18% response rates, complete response rates, which compare relatively favorably to the injectable agents, the IL-23s, Skyrizi, Tremfya, that are used in this indication. So really solid efficacy for a drug that's oral, and the safety looked good too. So this could be a big seller. The stock had a wild run. It was up over 500% this week. Its market cap is now $4 billion plus. I think they raised nearly $700 million just last night. So, really great success for an innovative product, even if we don't fully understand the mechanism, and one that's going to serve patients well. So congrats to the team at Abivax. I wanted to take the discussion in a little bit different direction, something that I found quite interesting, having served a little time in industry myself. And it relates to some news flow from Prime Medicine last week and Prime's decision to replace employee options. I can imagine that this is something that many in the industry are concerning. I'd love to get your views on this, guys. What Prime has done is take its underwater options. The company went public about 3 years ago at $17 per share. So most of the options that are held by employees, by executives, by boards are now underwater for sure. I think the stock is trading at around $4 and change today. And this creates a problem, right? If you have underwater options, you feel like you're not participating in the success of the company, especially if those options are way underwater, as I'm sure many Prime options are. And it prevents the options from doing what they're designed to do, which is aid employee retention and get buy-in from the employees and directors and executives of the group that's aligned with shareholders. So I know that we in the investment world hate when options are replaced. We feel like that misaligns the incentives that investors have, and maybe even creates some disincentives to properly perform on behalf of investors. But I don't know, Brian, do you want to start off? Any views on whether Prime's decision is a good one, and what else we could have done to further address employee retention for all of these companies that are seeing their stocks crushed, maybe through no fault of the teams themselves?
Yeah. I don't have great thoughts. I would say I think it's a tough dynamic. I get the need to retain people. I get the need that we are in a much different state than we were 4 years ago when we were sort of in this big bull market coming off of COVID. But at the same time, I sort of also see the value to seeing a little bit of the correction here. We sort of read it and over in the sector, having too many companies in development. And on one hand, sort of I totally feel the need and desire to try to retain key employees and try to maintain operations. But it's a catch-22, right?
Sam, any thoughts?
No, I think it's so same as no, I agree with Brian. Let's keep it there.
Paul, one thing that maybe caught my attention was that board options were being repriced as part of this. I mean, I think I could make the case that rank and file employees, need that incentive, need to feel like they're part of the team, need to feel that they have a reason to work hard for the equity. And they also have a decision to, walk across the street and get their options repriced, essentially, if they want to go work for CRISPR or for Editas or for the other gene. But the board maybe has more fiduciary duty to shareholders to be aligned and to not, take the easy way out. I don't know if you have thoughts.
I don't know. I mean, I totally agree with you. I don't want to I don't want to come off as disparaging them, just not super close to the situation. But I mean, it's I've heard of a number of other companies repricing people's options when there's been a blow up, right? Because at the end of the day, you can't double punish yourself. You can't have your drug, one of your key drugs not working, then all your key people leave. So I think that makes sense. The board piece seems atypical to me, but someone could also tell me this has happened 25 other times and I wouldn't know. I mean, do you have experience in the operating side? Have you heard of anything like this before?
Well, I mean, we've seen it a few times in our industry. It's not the first for sure, but there sometimes is an exclusion to board and senior management. And so for whatever reason, this time around, Prime decided not to do that. I'm sure they have good reason. They actually stated that it might be more cumbersome or more expensive to exclude certain people from the repricing, but it is what it is, and we can move on. I know we have other topics we want to cover. Maybe Sam, I'll turn it back to you. I think you wanted to talk about some pharma highlights.
Yeah, just a couple of things. We have a proprietary licensing data set that we've been gathering for years. And we've been looking at it. We look at it every 6 months. And I just want to highlight one thing out of it, and that is the perennial conversation about China, and share of drug licensing for drugs sourced out of China rose to 14%. And now there are many ways you could cut this, right? I mean, so we focus on actual drug licenses. We don't do any of these, look at any of those clinical collaborations or commercialization type deals in terms of regional commercialization type deals. So 14% is quite a hefty jump from the average 9% we had last year. And then, of course, close to nothing a few years back. And what was also interesting was that the majority of the drugs, that's close to 90% of them, are biologics that people are interested in. So, of course, we all know what they are, like the bispecifics, etc. That's in contrast to the ex-China deals where only 50% or so are biologics. And a whole bunch of them are almost half are preclinical discovery type deals. And the last point I want to make on that is the value perspective. When we want to look at how big these deals are, I'll just simply cut it at $1 billion in terms of bio dollars. And that's where the China deals had about a 40% share of the $1 billion plus deals. So that's pretty chunky number to be looking at. I'm going to then leave that at that. And the other thing was which we've heard this week. Of course, we had the Roche reporting. Last week we had Novartis and Johnson & Johnson. The only thing I want to focus on in there is they're all talking about this direct-to-consumer drug selling that the US is asking for them for. And what we've heard from Roche has talked about it a little bit now in headlines. Of course, Bristol Myers and Pfizer did it, or just announced it with Eliquis. Novartis CEO said that it's the core of all his discussions with HHS, which is quite interesting. So how the whole thing will come through, what do we need any legislation changes or not? It's going to be interesting to see. But it's quite interesting also that it's at the same time that we're getting talk about trying to stop advertising direct to consumers. You can sell direct to consumers, but you can't advertise to them. And put that together with what AstraZeneca announced, which was a $50 billion 5-year investment in the US. Maybe pharma companies are going to escape the wrath of tariffs because nothing's happened yet. Or maybe most favored nations is not going to come along because they're all, at least on surface, doing things that the administration's been asking for. Over.
Well, I also took note of those comments from Roche's CEO about how the easiest way to bring down pricing would be to go direct, cut out the middlemen, market to the consumer himself or herself, and that you could take down drug pricing easily about 50%, he said, right? But I don't know if you guys caught the remarks from our president earlier in the week, kind of a tongue-in-cheek comment from me here, but apparently 50% isn't enough. Apparently we've got to bring drug prices down 500, 600, even 1,000%. So I don't know, Sam, any way that the Roche CEO can bring down drug prices 1,000%?
I mean, look, you can give them all away. But
I don't think his HHS secretary wants people to be paid to take drugs.
That's right. But let's hope that these moves is going to help us escape some of those what I would call more draconian approaches that have been talked about.
I think you're right. Things are definitely looking up for the industry in terms of less of an impact from MFN or tariffs or any of the macro fears we were so obsessed with just 3 months ago.
Be careful. You're going to wake up in the morning. We have to eat humble pie.
Good point. Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode.